10 differences between men and women. These are not mine, I cut this out. Women gossip, but men keep abreast of current events. Women earn pin money, but men work in the black economy. Women get emotional, but men have nervous breakdowns. Women age, but men mature. Women are headstrong, but men are decisive. Women save for a rainy day, men invest. Women binge, but men have healthy appetites. Women are dizzy, men are eccentric. Women are pushy, but men are dynamic. Women nag, but men make their point forcefully. I don't know who wrote that, but bad case of male chauvinism. My most amusing, I think, difference between men and women is this. If a man falls over a chair in the middle of a room, if a woman falls over a chair in the middle of a room, she says, I just fell over a chair in the middle of the room. If a man falls over a chair in the middle of the room, he doesn't say that. He says, who put that chair in the middle of the room? We are very egotistical and we don't like blaming ourselves. One word that sticks in a man's throat is the word sorry. We don't like admitting we might be to blame or that we might have been weak. But I repeat my offer to you that if you tell me at the end of this session that you knew all about these differences between men and women, then you just go to the bookstall and help yourself to a free book. That offer is not being made to those who will watch this video, by the way. Well, now, it says at the beginning of your Bible, God made us male and female. He made us different. We are of equal value in his sight, equal dignity before him, equal status. But we are different. And it is those differences that we need to understand, not only if we are to fulfill our own role and responsibility, but if we're to appreciate the other gender, to appreciate women, what they can do that we can't, as well as what we can do and they can't. God made us complementary, not just within marriage, but within society generally. We have different contributions to make, which are both needed and need each other. Well, now, I want to start with the physical difference between men and women. Did you know what that is? Well, you know a bit of it. When did you first find out? I saw a lovely cartoon in, I forget what magazine, of a little boy and a little girl at the seaside splashing each other in the water, both stark naked, and the little girl was looking at the little boy's anatomy, the lower half, and studying it intensely. And finally she said, so that's the difference between Roman Catholics and Protestants. Well, we all found out these differences, either behind the bike shed at school or in all kinds of funny ways, not always from our parents, but we notice the difference. And the most obvious, of course, is the difference between our reproductive organs. And that very difference points to a basic and fundamental difference in the whole of our personality. It is quite clear from the way we are made physically that the male is to take the initiative. It is he who penetrates the female. And her body is built to respond to his initiative. He takes the first step, and she responds to that. Her body does that, but not just her body. Her mind and her spirit will respond to the male initiative. She is built that way. Even within the womb, after intercourse, it is the male sperm that is taking the initiative, swimming up to find that female egg. The male is, in a sense, active in that conception, and the female is passive. Not totally passive, for as soon as the sperm enters the egg, there is an immediate response. But all that reproductive system with which we're only too familiar tells us that the male is responsible and the female is responsive. That is the heart of the basic difference between them. That is why I wrote the book, Leadership is Male. Probably the best known and the least read book of 1988. I really got attacked for writing that book. I've had hundreds of letters of thanks for that book, and every single one from a woman. And I've discovered that most women are longing for men to take the lead. They want their men to be strong. They want their men to be responsible and make decisions, most of them. There are a few very strong feminists who disagree with that, but when I make that statement in a woman's setting, the response is very positive. The first time I spoke on this subject was in Düsseldorf in Germany at the European Convention of Women's Aglow. And I was the only man in a hall full of hundreds of women. And I said this, and the response was overwhelming. Many of them told me afterwards, we want men to be like this. We want them to lead. Our problem is they won't. So the man is to be responsible and the woman responsive. And let me say just something else. Many marriages have been ruined on the honeymoon, precisely because young men have not been told this difference. To put it very simply, a man can reach climax in intercourse very quickly indeed. A minute, 2 minutes. The average woman takes 20 to 25 minutes to respond to the point where she climaxes and experiences the pleasure. So many men are ruining their marriages by not being responsible enough to restrain themselves until their wives can join them in what God designed to be one of the most exquisite pleasures on earth. So you can see what I'm saying. Even in intercourse, the man needs to exercise responsibility. Otherwise, his wife is not going to get pleasure, and it won't be long before he comes home and finds a little note on the kitchen table. Your slippers are in the fridge, and your supper's in the dog, and I've gone to bed with a headache. That kind of reaction is saying, I'm not putting up with it. It is no pleasure to me, and God intended it to be. But it won't be if the man doesn't exercise responsibility for his wife in that, and see that she reaches the climax at the same time as he does. I'll tell you this, couples that have learned that, to share that pleasure together at the same moment, have found one of the greatest secrets of staying together. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But everybody is aware of those differences, I hope. But there are many, many other physical differences which we're not aware of until it's pointed out. For example, our bone structure, our skeleton, is quite different. And that is why a forensic scientist, after a skeleton has been dug up that's been buried for 20 years or much, much longer, even a mummy, can say that is a woman or a man with confidence, because the bones are different. A man's bones are thicker and stronger and altogether rougher than the delicate bones of a woman. Our muscles are quite different. A man's muscles is primarily designed for pushing and pulling, for that kind of movement. Striated is the technical term for a man's muscles. A woman's muscles are primarily built for carrying, particularly in the pelvic region, but throughout her body. I've been amazed when I've gone to Africa and other countries to see the loads that women can carry on their heads by keeping their back straight. But they can carry immense loads. My wife can lift far heavier things than I can credit her. But for pushing and pulling, no. Therefore, if you're having to kickstart the car by pushing it, then you push it and get your wife to steer, but be sure to tell her what to do. But you are much better at pushing and pulling, and she is better at carrying. I read recently of a Scotsman in the Hebrides who landed himself in a hospital with a double rupture. And when the doctor asked him, what were you doing to get this? He said, I was lifting a heavy crate onto my wife's back. And he'd given himself a double rupture. There is a truth in that, actually. Our bones are different, our muscles are different, our fat is different. It is disposed in a different way. We all know where it comes to in a man. I was talking to a man with a huge beer belly recently, and he said, it's all right, the fat belongs to the Lord, and it's all paid for. But that's where it comes with us. You know you're middle-aged when your age shows around the middle. More than that, our skin is different, and this is a very important practical point. In a woman's skin, the nerve endings are much nearer the surface than with us. Our skin is tougher, less sensitive. Hers is much more sensitive. A surprising fact, however, is that my wife can lift much hotter plates than I can, which seems to go against that. But nevertheless, it is true that her skin is far more sensitive than mine. And the very practical implication for that is this. A man can get a sexual message only from the skin of certain parts of his body, not all over. But a woman can get a sexual message from any part of her skin. Touchy does far more to a woman than a man. And the practical implication of that is this. First, your wife needs to be touched. One of the ways you can prove that you love her is to touch her. And she gets the message. Many men don't do that. Keep their hands right off their wives. And they don't get the message. I want you to imagine a husband and wife, and the wife is saying, do you still love me? Of course I do. This is a romantic conversation, you understand. But you never say so. Shouldn't need to, after all these years. I've stayed with you, haven't I? This is how to develop a wife's arousal and get her to respond. But one touch, one hug would have made that conversation unnecessary. However, in saying that your wife needs to be touched, it means being careful about touching other women. We have now entered a new phase of church life where there's an awful lot of huggy-kissy fellowship around. And we need to learn the difference between a kiss and a holy kiss. You know the difference? 2 minutes. And sometimes I stand around at the church door and watch the pastor. And I've noticed some pastors give hugs and lovely kisses to all the young, pretty wives, but the dear old age pensioners who've lost their looks, good handshake. You see, touching is important. Skin is much more sensitive in a woman. Our mortality is very different. We men are weak, the weaker sex at both ends of life. As babies, we are the weaker. As old men, we are the weaker. That's why there are more widows than widowers by far. If you want the figures, I've got them here. At conception, the figure of deaths is 150 male to 100 female. Conceptions that take place and then fail under a miscarried. At birth, the deaths are 106 males to 100 females. So even at birth, we're still the more liable to perish. It doesn't equalize till the age of 4. And then at the age of 4, the deaths of male and female are equal. At the other end of life, of course, it swings right back the other way and even further. And my average life expectancy is a good deal less than my wife's, as any insurance company will tell you. So we are weaker at both ends, but stronger in the middle. And that's a difference that is not environmental, it's purely biological. Let's talk about breasts for a moment. It may never have struck you, but it will now, that the human species is the only species where the female has full breasts when not feeding young. Now, if you know anything about other mammals, you'll know that their breasts swell out and fill up with milk when there's a youngster to be nourished. But there are women who have never had a baby and never will have a baby who have very full breasts. That makes our species unique. Now, what's the significance of that? For that, we have to turn to the Song of Solomon in the Bible, where in chapter 1, the young lady says about her young man, "My lover is nestling between my two breasts." My lover is, not my baby is, my lover is. And there it is in the Word of God. And I read one commentary on that book which said the two breasts symbolize the Old and the New Testament. And I thought, help! Well, that puts the man in the Apocrypha for a start. But I really developed a guilt complex. I thought, I must be a very carnal man. Because when I read that verse, I don't think about the Old and the New Testaments. I thought, should I confess this? I'm a very carnal man. But I was thrilled when I discovered that the Song of Solomon is not written in code. It's not an allegory. It's a simple analogy. That the love between a young man and a young woman is an analogy for the love we can have with the Lord. And that when the Lord says two breasts, he means two breasts. And when he says pomegranates, he means pomegranates. The Lord means what he says. And I was released. And there in the center of the Bible is this erotic love song. And it's got nothing about God, nothing about heaven, nothing about salvation. There's nothing spiritual in it at all. It's all about the love between a young man and a young woman. But it's God's way of saying, I made that. I intended that. And therefore, in the human species and the human species alone, breasts are not just for nourishing young. They are for the comfort of adults as well as the nourishment of babies. That's the origin of page 3, which was not God's intention. But nevertheless, human breasts in the female are not just for nourishing the young. They're for comfort and companionship with someone of the other sex within marriage. Well, now, blood is different, hormones are different, the nervous system is different, brains are different. I'm not going into all these differences now, but I want to pick up the brain thing and move on to the psychological differences, which are even more important for men to realize, especially within the close relationship of marriage. If you don't realize the differences of thinking and feeling, then you are liable to judge your wife by yourself and misunderstand quite deeply. And this becomes frustrating to a wife. Well, now let's look at these psychological differences. Our brain is in two hemispheres. There are two parts to it. I'm sure you've seen pictures of a brain clearly in two lobes. And men use one side primarily and women use the other. There is a move today to persuade us each to use the other side more. For example, art classes, drawing with the other side of the brain, is a course that my wife recently took. It was fascinating that she had to struggle to use the other side of her brain to draw, the side that a man would normally use for perspective in 3 dimensions, but which she wouldn't. A man on the whole trusts his intellect much more than a woman, whereas she will trust her intuition. And they again are different sides of the brain. Let's take one of the most obvious differences. Language is on the woman's side of the brain. Linguistics are much easier for a woman than a man. Or to put it very simply, a man will find it far more difficult to put his thoughts and feelings into words than his wife will. A wife can immediately talk about her innermost tensions, feelings, thoughts, pour it out. A man is almost tongue-tied when asked, what's your greatest fear? What's your biggest temptation? And he will not know how to put it. And this has a profound effect, that she finds it easier to communicate with him than he does with her. And probably the breakdown of communication is responsible for more breakups in marriage than almost anything else. But it affects church life too. When you have an open time of prayer in your church, who prays first, a man or a woman? Who prays most, the men or the women? You check it out next time. Many couples, Christian couples, know that they should be praying together, but they don't. And the reason is that they tried and came unstuck, because she just poured out her heart, prayer after prayer. She just poured out and kept going. And he, after a few sentences, gets stuck and doesn't know what to say next. We have to learn to pray aloud. It doesn't come naturally. See what I'm talking about? This is why most translators and interpreters in places like Brussels and the United Nations are women. They can handle 2 languages at once. This is their gifting. It's their side of the brain. We can develop speech, but it doesn't come naturally. Have you ever noticed how often when a couple is interviewed on television after some domestic disaster, the husband sits there like a mugwump, silent, while his wife does all the talking to the camera? Do you know that's as old as the Garden of Eden? I don't know if you realize that when Satan spoke to Eve, Adam was standing right there. And Satan never addressed him, and Adam never addressed Satan. He left his wife to do all the talking, and that's where it all went wrong. Because she misquoted the word of God, which had been said to Adam. She got it wrong. And he should have corrected her immediately and say, God didn't say that. For example, Satan said to Eve, has God told you not to eat any of the trees of the garden, any of the fruit in the trees in the garden? That's not what God had said. And Adam should have come in straight away and said, you're wrong. But Adam just stood there like a mugwump, saying nothing. And he allowed Eve to be deceived, taken into a conversation she couldn't handle, into a situation she couldn't resist. And he said and did nothing. Which is why in the rest of the Bible, Eve is not blamed for the first sin on earth. Adam is held responsible. And he was responsible. Well, this is a thing we've got to battle with. This is why in a men's discipling group, we need to learn to pray aloud, to speak our thoughts, to get it out, to share with one another how we feel, what we're struggling with. It's a big barrier, and it will only be overcome within an all-male brotherhood. I've learned that you cannot disciple men in a mixed group. Men will never open up about their innermost fears, problems, doubts in front of their wives and children. They want their family to see a strong image of a man who can handle life. And that's right. But that man needs a brotherhood where he can speak it out and share. It doesn't come naturally. Of course, to rush to something I'll enlarge on this afternoon, when a man is baptized in the Holy Spirit and filled with the Spirit, one of the first things that happens is he's released in speech. And most of the gifts of the Spirit are speech gifts, a word of wisdom, a word of knowledge, a word of prophecy, a word of tongue, a word of interpretation. Most of the gifts that God uses to do good in this world are speech gifts. Indeed, he brought the whole universe into being with a word. But if we men suffer from lockjaw and the church is full of silent male saints, then the world is going to suffer. And even the church will be at a loss. Men need to be released in speech. Doesn't come naturally. But I can tell you that when I first began to preach in church, I was so nervous. I drained every glass of water in every pulpit. And it was usually an interesting study in pond life that hadn't been renewed for months. But I would drain those, I would choke. Pharaoh's plague of frogs attacked my throat every time I got up. I had diarrhea for days before. You may not believe that. I still do, from time to time, suffer from nerves. And last thing I'd rather do would get up in front of a bunch like you and talk. But yeah, I've had to learn to use the other side of the brain that the Spirit has enabled me to do. Let's look at some of the other simple differences. A man can think in abstract terms. A woman thinks in terms of the concrete. A man thinks about the theory. She is very practical. She will say, well, how does it work out? She thinks in pragmatic terms. A man can talk about things endlessly. At the same time, his wife will be talking about people. A bunch of men at one end of the room will be talking about motorbikes or the football. A bunch of women at the other are talking about the men at the other end of the room. Their interest is in people. I meant to include in my first talk a little bit about Australia. Let me return to that. I was a bit lost about the timing earlier this morning, so missed out some things. When I went to Australia, I thought I was going to a man's world. One of my heroes when I was a boy was Chips Rafferty. Does that mean anything to anybody here? Put your hand up, comfort me. Oh boy, you're much older than you look. But he was my ideal of a man as he drove the cattle right across Australia away from the Japs, with corks round his hat and Foster's lager in both hands. He was a man. How many of you know Crocodile Dundee? All right. Well, now, Chips Rafferty was the Crocodile Dundee of my day. And so I thought I was going to a man's country. And I made an astonishing discovery. In Australia, the men are only men when they're among men. That's in the bar or wherever, the football, they are men among men. But when they get among women, they turn into mice. And when my wife was with me and we went to a social event, within 5 minutes, all the men were at that end of the room and the women at that end. They never met again. She couldn't cope with that at all. Mixed company was a situation which the men just zipped up their lips and stayed totally silent. Therefore, in the home and in the churches, it was the women who took the lead every time, who spoke out. And I went to a sociologist and I said, this country is the most matriarchal country I've ever been in, not excluding the States. I said, the women run the home and the church. And he said, yes, we even have coined a special word for it, for Australian men, matridoxy. And that's the word we use. I said, why? What's behind this? He said, it is the fact that Australia was a penal colony. He said, New Zealand wasn't. New Zealand actually was a Christian settlement, hence the names Christchurch and names like that. But Australia was a prison, a penal colony. And in the early decades, there were 19 men to one woman, and she was probably a prostitute. And so there was no normal social intercourse, and the men didn't have the opportunity to develop normal social relations with women, and that shadow is still over them. When I the previous last visit, I said, please make all the meetings men only. I have a burden for the men of Australia. And when I got off the jumbo jet, the man who'd arranged it said, I'm very sorry, David, but only one meeting in each place is for men. I said, but why? I didn't say that as a personal preference. I said, I believe God gave me the burden to come to Australia for the men. And he said, well, the women wouldn't wear it. So I said, okay. And then the first place I went to, which will be nameless, men's meeting the first night, 1,000 men. We had a great time. Next night, mixed. As soon as it was over, a lady came up to me afterwards. She said, Mr. Pawson, I have some questions about what you said last night. I said, but you weren't here last night. No, but I've got some questions about what you said. I said, but how do you know what I said last night? I made her tell me. When her husband got home, this may happen to some of you later today, when her husband got home, she pinned him up against the kitchen wall and said, what did he tell you? And she demanded everything. He had to spill the beans before he got his beans on toast. It was, that was it. Well, we dealt with her, and then another large lady came forward with a small man a yard behind her. And she said, my husband has a question about what you said last night. And I thought, what is happening? And I said, is that your husband behind you? Yes, and this is his question. And I literally pushed her out of the way, and I pulled him forward by the lapel, and I said, you can ask me yourself, what's your question? And he said, can a woman be an elder in the church? I said, why is she? I said, is she an elder at home as well? And his eyeballs rolled like a jackpot machine, you know. Now, you've laughed at him, but I tell you, there are so many marriages in church here like that. You see, that man had married his mother. I don't mean his physical mother. I mean, when he'd left home and left his own mother, he looked for a wife who would be his mother, a substitute mother. And in fact, had she been talking about her son like that, I wouldn't have even thought it out of the way, would you? If he'd been her little boy and she'd come and said, my boy has a question about what you said, would you have thought that was funny? No. And it told me that their marriage, what it was like, that she was his mother. And he probably wanted it that way at first, but was now finding that that's not what makes a good marriage. Now, it's nice to be mothered when you're sick or tired, but if that's the whole of the relationships, it's not a Christian marriage. She's your wife, not your mother. And that's why one of the hardest things you can say to your wife is, you don't make Yorkshire pudding like my mother used to. You're making a comparison between her and mother, which is not the right comparison. Well, where did I get onto this? It is learning the difference between men and women and learning about our roles and responsibilities. Let's take a few other differences. In music, men compose and women arrange. You'll find that men do most of the composing of music, though they've been free, women have been free for centuries to write music, but it's men who do it. But the women are good at arranging music once it's been composed. Or take mathematics. Men find mathematics comparatively easy. Women find it much harder. Let's take a thing like chess. There are about 54 world chess masters and about 500 champions. You can count the women in both groups on one hand. Chess is a man's game because it requires a lot of thinking through, working out mentally. It's essentially a male game. Let's take a few other instances. Men like to tackle big things. Women can care for little things. Those of you who are married, does your wife have a list of little jobs waiting to be done? Or is it even a big list of little jobs waiting to be done? Let me have an imaginary conversation. Wife, the kitchen tap is dripping. Husband, well, be patient. You know that I'm going to build you a new kitchen. I've been to MFI, I've chosen the cabinets, I've got it all planned out. Give me time and you're going to get a whole new kitchen. But I just want the dripping tap sorted out. That's too little a detail for men. We want something big. There are a few weeds in the flower bed that need digging out. Look, I'm planning a rockery and a pond for there. And I'll have it built in no time. You wait. You see, we tackle big challenges. The detail, not so easy to come by. But let me come to some of the much more fundamental differences. The great debate in all this, by the way, is this conditioned or is it constitutional? Are we born with these differences or are they imposed on us by our upbringing? And the humanist answer is constantly saying these differences are purely the result of environment and education. It's the way we bring up boys and girls that make the differences. If we change all that, then we can produce persons who are neutral in these ways and not different. Actually, modern research is heading right back in the opposite direction and saying these differences are born in us. For example, when we're children, You put a boy and a girl to draw. Say you can draw anything you like. The boy will invariably draw something mechanical, and the girl will invariably draw something domestic. At 4 months or 5 months, a girl can recognize a person in a photograph. A boy will take many more months, but a boy will respond to a mechanical toy immediately at 5 months. Many, many other differences. If you want to study all these, buy a fascinating little book, which my wife has just finished reading, called Why Men Don't Iron. It's a very clever title. But my wife, after she'd read the book, she said, I really understand you better now than I've ever done. Well, we need to understand wives too, and these differences. They are born within us. It is not education or environment that makes these differences. Education picks up the differences. Let me share with you one of the most serious developments in our society. Not only are churches being increasingly feminized, but our schools are too. Our whole educational system for the last 20 years has been gradually changed to a feminine education. And now suddenly we're waking up to the fact that the boys are way behind the girls in academic achievement. You must have noticed the headlines in this. What led up to this? The answer is this, that boys need competition to motivate them to learn. Boys need to be competitive with someone else. But competition has been increasingly crushed out of education. Exams are increasingly politically incorrect because people pass or fail. Everybody must pass. I'm sure you're aware of this whole trend. And the result is that our whole educational system now is heavily weighted in favor of girls. Of course, our employment system is also weighted that way because 2/3 of all the jobs that come available now go to women. 2/3. Unemployment is becoming a male problem. And I'll talk about that more this afternoon. But our education is now thoroughly feminized, as the church has been. Our schools are also. Well, now look at more fundamental differences. Here is one. Forget all the others. A man is goal-oriented, but a woman is need-oriented. Now let's explore that a bit. A man, to fulfill his potential, must have a goal in front of him that he hasn't reached. He must have a purpose to go for. Even getting up in the morning, he must feel he's got something to go for, something to aim at, something to achieve that day. That's what motivates him. This is why unemployment hits men far worse than women, because it robs a man of getting up in the morning with a goal. This is why there is so much midlife crisis among men, because by the age of 40, most men have reached their goal. Sportsmen have reached it even earlier. And the problem becomes, what do you go for now? You've climbed the mountain, you found there's little there, so what's the next mountain? And that's when many men go a bit crazy in the midlife crisis. It's got nothing to do with hormones. It's simply that a man has reached his goal and doesn't know where to go next. And so suddenly he heads off into the blue to sail around the world. He trades in the wife for a later model, and he starts driving a sports car again, and he's looking for a new goal. And men in their 40s often have this crisis because most men have got as high up the ladder as they're going to get by 40. And now they're faced with 20 years more stuck at that level. Am I touching a nerve here? But you know this happens. And men need a goal to go for. They need a future that they haven't reached, but that they're going to. What an advantage it is to be a Christian. Because you will have a goal to reach for to your dying breath. Many men who retire are dead 2 or 3 years later because they no longer have a goal. They no longer have a purpose. We must have a goal, something to aim for, however small or however remote. We are goal-oriented. That means that men live for the future. You getting hold of this? We live for something on ahead, not the now. We live for the then. And we've got to have something in the then that keeps us going to reach it. And we set ourselves all kind of goals, political, commercial, financial, status, but we go for it. And that's what keeps men going. Now, women don't need that at all. And we shouldn't expect them to. Women are need-oriented. And they are most fulfilled when they're meeting an immediate need. Even just saying in a crisis, I'll put the kettle on, does something for a woman. It helps her to cope with the crisis. A man will stand there and think of the consequences of all this and what this is all going to mean. Whereas she says, what can I do now to meet this need? And unemployed women can usually find needs that they can still meet, even on a voluntary basis without being paid. But men without the goal are lost. They feel they're on the rubbish heap, that they're of no value, that society doesn't value them. Whether they're paid a dole adequate or not is beside the point. They've been robbed of their fundamental reason for existence. But women are need-oriented. Therefore, women live in the present. They tend not to think ahead too much. They think about the now and what is needed here and now. To illustrate this in a humorous way, and this is the only criticism of my wife you will hear today, it is when we go into unknown territory in the car and I drive and she navigates. Am I touching a chord? I sense it immediately. And she responds to the immediate situation while I think ahead. And often if I have time, I did this morning, I get a road atlas out and I trace my journey and all the numbers of the roads, and I know when I should be looking for the 429 and the A2. I did get lost, not realizing the chart I had was not to scale. And I didn't think the research center was so far out of Sittingbourne, but anyway, I got here finally. But I'd been thinking ahead all the time. My wife sits by my side and she says, we should have turned left at the last crossroads. Or in the middle of the traffic lights, quickly, turn right. And whatever traffic is all around, crisis, you know. But and I keep saying to her, look, just look at the map and count the number of roundabouts we have to pass before we reach that one. Or just notice when we have to turn. But no, she sits in the present and she responds to the present all the time. It's just an illustration. I need to understand that for her, to plan a route is quite an exercise. She's got to use the other side of her brain. And I'm beginning to get her a little educated in this, and she's getting better. I hope I'm getting a better driver too. The other huge difference is that a man can differentiate himself. Well, let me put it simpler. A man can split himself up into parts. A woman will always act as one whole. She doesn't like a life that's in compartments. She wants the whole of life to be a single integrated experience. That is why a woman who goes out to work will take photographs of her family to show the others at work, a thing that a man doesn't usually do. But she wants her workplace and her home to be integrated. She wants the people at work to know about her life in the family. She wants to bring them together. She's constantly unifying her life into one life. A man, on the other hand, can live 4 or 5 totally different lives simultaneously. He can be one person at work, another in the club, another at home, and never these different lives will meet. And he just adapts. I've noticed some men who are very shy in the church. I go and visit them at work, especially if they wear a uniform, and they're totally different. They're commanding, they're strong, in charge, and yet in another part of their life, they're quite sheepish. Do you know what I mean? We are able to adapt. Therefore, a very practical word for us men. Men can be in love with more than one woman, but a woman can't. Now, this is a very, very important difference. And it means that we men have temptations that women don't. A man can quite easily cope with 3 different women in his life and having an entirely different relationship with each one. He can have a wife at home to be his domestic woman. He can have a mistress at work. He can visit a prostitute for excitement. And he can say, I'm in love with all these women. One day his wife finds out and she says, you don't love me anymore. He says, what makes you say that? Well, I've heard all about the other woman that you love. So you can't love me anymore. And he says, but I do. And he does with part of himself. You still following me? But it's a compartment. It's one kind of love. And he feels he needs another kind of love. And so he has another woman for that. This was common in the Roman Empire when the New Testament was written. It was normal for a man to have a wife and a concubine and still visit prostitutes. He was having different kinds of love in the different situations. And within the situation, he loved them all. That is why most of the words in the Bible about sexual temptation are addressed to men. Now, on the other hand, a woman can love one man at once. And therefore, and here's something very important, if her husband really loves her and she feels that, she will never look at another man. She may have friends, other men, but she won't love any other man if she is really loved by her husband. And so when a husband tells me his wife has gone off with somebody else, my first question is, did you really love her? And did she realize that? Because if she did, she would never have looked at anybody else. A wife's not going to go off with the milkman if she's really loved by her husband. It doesn't happen. But the husband has the problem. And I've heard many people, Christians even, justify divorce and remarriage to me because they say, but don't you see, I fell in love with somebody else. As if that justifies breaking up the marriage. But it's perfectly possible to fall in love with somebody else. That doesn't make it right to say, I must get out of this marriage and follow that one. But this is because we are compartmentalized. Now that is both our strength and our weakness. Just as a woman's desire to have an integrated life is her strength and her weakness. To put it simply, a man can separate his thoughts from his feelings. But a woman can't. Her thoughts and feelings are totally bound up together. And this is why you can argue with a man, but not with a woman. If you argue with a man, it's thoughts challenging thoughts. But it doesn't necessarily affect the feelings you have for somebody. You follow me? If you go to the House of Commons, since it was televised, I've been embarrassed by the way they slang each other across the House. Haven't you? I mean, it's dreadful. And there the green carpet has 2 red strips in it, 2 sword lengths apart, and they mustn't put a toe over so they don't come to blows. But they slang each other verbally and call each other all sorts of dreadful things. But those same men you'll find treating each other to drinks at the House of Commons bar immediately after the debate. Because their thoughts have been clashing, but their feelings for each other were not into it. They may even have felt angry or frustrated about the thoughts, but it didn't enter their feelings for the person. And that is why it is easier for men to discuss something and not break a relationship. But Mrs. Thatcher was not like that. See, when she disagreed with a man, she took it personally. And so will most women. Because you're not just sharing thoughts, you're touching their integrated personality, you're touching their feelings. In disagreeing, you are offending feelings as well. And that's what happened to Mrs. Thatcher when finally the last man with whom she came into government rebelled. she was finished 2 months later. She had lost every man in her team because she'd taken it so personally. Now that's something we do need to understand. That is why we need to be careful about arguing. There are 2 ways that men can win an argument with their wives. One is to shut up and refuse to talk anymore. Just let off steam. If you don't do that and go moody and silent, the other way is this. And that's when physical abuse comes into the marriage. Especially when a man feels that verbally she has won the argument because of her linguistic skill. She's won it verbally, so he can only resort to shutting up or hitting out. And that is, again, a pattern that's only too familiar to social workers. Now, I've said that it is both the strength and the weakness of male and female, this difference. I've shown you some of the weakness of the female, but her strength is that she is a source of unity. Women are much better at bringing things together than we are. We can keep them separate, but they can integrate life and bring together. They can unite a family. A grandmother within a family can be a profound influence in keeping the family together. But now let's look at the male strength and weakness of being able to separate thoughts and feelings. That puts us in an advantageous position to deal with things objectively. Whereas the woman is going to handle it subjectively, how she feels is going to be a major part of her decision. A man can stand back, as it were, put his feelings to one side and say, now let's reason this thing out. Let's look at it objectively. Let's see what's right and wrong in the situation. My wife needs me to do that. Whereas I need her intuition to back up my conclusion. Though her intuition works a lot more quickly than my intellect. We were counseling a vicar and his wife once, and we counseled them for 2 hours, and I felt I was no nearer the problem after 2 hours. And as we came away, I said to my wife, what's wrong with that couple? And she said it was obvious. That's a little irritating, isn't it? It offended my intellect because my intellect hadn't grasped anything. And I said, what is the problem? She said, the vicar loves his church more than his wife. I said, he never said that. And she said he was saying that every time he opened his mouth. And we were able to go back and then deal with it. I analyze, I think things through. I come to a conclusion. And usually it's a conclusion my wife came to 6 weeks earlier. But anyway, it's good to have her intuition. On the other hand, there are times when she has gone to hear a preacher and she's come away and she says to me, well, he was very interesting and very impressive, but she said, I was uneasy. And she said, I don't know why. She said, my spirit wasn't responding to him. And I say, tell me what he said. And when she tells me, and I analyze it in the light of Scripture, I say, I can tell you now why you were uneasy. Something wasn't right. She sensed it, but she couldn't explain it. And a husband and wife can be of immense value to each other by the husband explaining things and the wife sensing them. The two can really be quite powerful together. However, and here I come to very practicalities, it means that discipline should be in male hands. A woman will find it very difficult to discipline others because her feelings get in the way. I was speaking 2 weeks ago in the Gray's Inn Court in London, where all the lawyers have their headquarters. I mustn't get sidetracked, but it was a fascinating debate in which I was taking part. Lord Mackay, the former Lord Chancellor, chaired the debate. And the debate was Jesus a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord? Well, I was really ready for that. The president of the British Secularist Society took the line that Jesus was a liar. The professor of biology in the University of London took the line that he was a lunatic, and I had to speak that he was the Lord. And there were about 250 lawyers there, so I tried to make it a bit of a brief. You may be interested in the voting at the end of the debate. It was 5% in favor of liar or lunatic, 15% abstained, but 80% said he must be the Lord, which was fascinating. But there it is. It's just leading up to a story that's going around the lawyers. And the story is that a woman was accused of murdering her husband. And all the evidence, eyewitnesses, circumstantial evidence, it was all pointing to her guilt. But the jury could not come to a unanimous verdict. And so the judge went for a majority verdict, and they produced an 11-1 guilty of murder. The 11 were men, the one was a woman. And when she was asked, why did you not vote? She was so obviously guilty of murdering her husband. The woman juror replies, well, I was so sorry for her because she's a widow. Now that may sound thoroughly illogical to you, but it's a woman's feelings getting into her decision. You with me? And the joke has a bit of truth in it. Now that means that men must take responsibility for discipline, because discipline means setting aside your personal feelings and asking whether punishment is deserved or not. And a wife is right to say to a child who's misbehaved, wait till your father gets home. And he must come home and take that responsibility of deciding whether that child should be punished or not. This is why it is so difficult for single mothers to bring up children properly. They either veer to becoming too soft and letting the children have their own way and everything, or to make up for the husband, they become too strict and too domineering. And either way, I've noticed that most single mothers go to one extreme or the other. They find it very difficult to be objective about punishment. Now comes the rub for the church. The missing dimension of the church today in England is discipline. It is hardly ever exercised in church. And in churches that are led by women or have a woman vicar, it is never exercised, because a woman finds it so difficult to confront a person with what is wrong and punish it if necessary. We're told in the New Testament that we are not to judge people outside the church. When will Christians learn that? We are not to judge immorality outside the church. That is not our business. But we are to judge it inside the church. But the church has got very good at condemning it outside and overlooking it inside, because that requires male objectivity. That is why I believe the elders in a church ought to be men. Where they are mixed, or even more where they are the majority of women, as is now the case in the Church of Scotland, who have more women elders than men now, then discipline goes out of the window. It is a man's job to discern wrong and deal with it and apply discipline. Now, discipline is part of the New Testament church picture. There's no question about that. There are various steps that the church needs to take when a member is misbehaving and bringing the gospel into disrepute. Step number 1 is to go privately to that person and say, you're doing wrong. You're letting the side down. You're bringing disgrace on the church and an offense to the gospel that you shouldn't have. Because the world is very quick to spot faults in Christians, believe me. They really are, quicker than we are. He calls himself a Christian, and yet if you study his business accounts, you'll find something rather different. The world is very quick to judge us. It's one of the ways God keeps us on the straight and narrow. He lets the world see when we're not. The second step is, if the person doesn't listen to a private rebuke, and repent and put it right, then you take witnesses with you. And out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the person is told. If he still won't listen, third step, you tell it to the church, the whole church. And the whole membership must face the person. And if still that person takes no notice, then you have no option but to put them out of fellowship, to excommunicate. Now, Jesus told us to do this, but where is it being done in this country? And there's a final step, which is the hardest of all, and I have been involved in just 1 or 2 situations of this kind, where if still even being put out of fellowship has no effect on a Christian who's misbehaving, you have one last thing that you can do, one last sanction. And that sanction is to deliver them to Satan, which actually means in practice that you are putting them physically in the hands of the devil so that he can do something to their body that will bring them to their senses. It's the last resort of church discipline, but it is saying then Satan must have freedom to bring you sickness or even death, if that will save you on the day of judgment. You're doing it to save them, to redeem them, to get them back on course. Now, all that requires courage and conviction. It is not easy to confront people. Nevertheless, it is part of the picture of the church which we have in the New Testament. And I've found that women find it very, very difficult to do that. Their feelings get in the way. Can I bring it down to brass tacks? I've written a book on hell. It was one of the most difficult books that I've had to write. But I've felt suddenly about 7 or 8 years ago that there was a widespread turning away from the belief in hell. Set off, I'm afraid, by probably the leading evangelical Christian in this country, John Stott, who admitted quite openly in print that he couldn't accept hell as eternal torment. And suddenly everybody else said, well, if he doesn't believe it, we don't need to. And even Bible-believing Christians all over this country suddenly didn't believe in hell anymore. Actually, I suspect that they'd stopped talking about it years before. And now they were relieved that they hadn't. But I wrote the book. It's a call back to Bible teaching on the subject. And I called attention to the remarkable fact that within our Bible, it is only taught by Jesus, not by anyone else. As if there was only one person that God could trust to give us the right view. I was interviewed on many BBC local radios about this book, and the interviewer always began with the same question. It got very boring. The question was, how can a God of love send anybody to hell? And my response was to ask a question back. I've learned that from Jesus. The best way to deal with the question is to ask one back. The ball goes in the other court. And my question back was, where on earth did you get the idea that God was a God of love? And this shattered the interviewer. They would stammer and stutter and say, well, doesn't everybody believe that? Or I said, no, come on, where did you get that idea, that God was a God of love? And finally they would say, well, didn't Jesus tell us that? I said, yes, he did, and that's why I believe it. But he was the one who also told us about hell in terms of the utmost horror. Now I said, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to say he was telling the truth when he said God was love and telling a lie when he talked about hell? That's just pick and mix, isn't it? How do you know when he told the truth? Usually the interviewed ended quite quickly before time. But it's amazing how many people find it difficult to believe in hell. As the church has been increasingly feminized, hell has gone. Wonder when you last heard it preached about. Well, now what I'm leading up to is this. My wife knew about this book, of course. I go into a garden shed and bury myself for 2 or 3 weeks to write a book. And while I was there, she fed me with courage and coffee. And but she said, David, while I believe everything you're writing, I couldn't write that book. I said, why not? She said, because just even talking about hell makes me think of relatives, friends that are going there or are already there. And she said, it becomes too much. My feelings get too deep. I can understand that, because I had to weep over people, but I had to write the book. You see, what will happen in a church that is feminized is that only half of God will be preached. Paul says, behold then the goodness and the severity of God. That's the whole picture. But in a feminized church, you'll hear about his goodness, but not about his severity. And broadcast religion is a classic example. Preachers on television and radio know that people can just switch them off if they say something they don't like. And so you rarely hear the severity of God preached on TV and radio, do you? Broadcast services, songs of praise. It's all about how nice God is, how loving he is, how helpful he is, all of which is true. But if the severity is not preached, I'll tell you what will vanish. The fear of God will go. And there's as much fear of God in the New Testament as in the Old. I'll say more about that again this afternoon. So we have a situation where the people of God need the leadership of men. That's what led me to write that book, Leadership is Male. And as I told you and say in the preface to the book, I first gave the material to about 1,500 women in Dusseldorf. And at the end of that conference, one German woman came to me. She wasn't uptight, but she was quite severe. And she said, well, Mr. Pawson, we've heard the truth from you, and we've seen it in your wife. That's probably the nicest thing that anyone has said about her. And I make a joke of it, of course, laugh it off. I say, well, I preach and she practices. That's how we manage together. But I know that I should be practicing too. The church needs men to apply discipline in the church, to challenge what's happening. I hardly go to a single church today without finding adultery in the church, accepted and unchallenged, either in its crudest form of men who've left their wives and living with someone else, or in its respectable form, they have ditched their wife and married someone else, which Jesus called adultery. Do you know, I've been in more trouble for saying that publicly in the last 10 years than anything else I've said. Caused a riot at Spring Harvest, and they've told me I will never be invited back because I challenged Christians who have left their partners because they prefer someone else. And it's happening all over the church. Unchallenged, accepted, and churches are even blessing it. Well, I throw that out. I'm writing a book on it because, again, the Lord has given me a huge burden about it. I'm aware that it's a most sensitive and emotive thing to say because there are always people in your congregation who are profoundly affected. And most preachers seem to be intimidated to the point where they dare not quote what Jesus said about that issue. But there it is. Men are needed who have the courage. Where are the Mr. Whitehouses? Hear me? Where are the men who will rise up in anger within the church and say that bishop ought not to be a bishop if he doesn't believe in the virgin birth or the bodily resurrection? But we let it go by. And that brings me to the second area in church life where men are needed. And I've already hinted at it. The area of doctrine. The area of what we believe, not just how we behave. Discipline is needed in the area of behavior. But in the area of doctrine, I've mentioned the subject of hell and the severity of God. It takes men to preach that. I've been preaching on hell quite a lot recently because nobody else seems to be. It is a costly subject to teach. And yet the response I've had is this, letter after letter saying, this has restored to me the fear of the Lord. Now I find that people who don't believe in hell don't fear the Lord. It seems to go together. It is basically a neglect of the fact that God is our judge. And so I turned to my Bible to write this book, Leadership as Male. And in one Christian bookshop, it was sold in a plain brown paper bag from under the counter. As if it was pornographic or something. All the negative reaction I've had has been from people who didn't read it, who just assumed from the title that I was an old-fashioned chauvinist pig. But those who read it came to a different view. This doesn't put women down at all. It puts men face to face with their responsibility. When we look through the Bible, it is men who have the responsibility, not the right, but the responsibility to lead. Right from the beginning, Genesis 2 says 3 things about Adam and Eve. It says Eve was made after Adam, Eve was made from Adam, and Eve was made for Adam. And every one of those 3 things is quoted in the New Testament, talking about relationships between Christian men and women. That she was made after Adam means that he was the firstborn and therefore responsible for her. And yet when God challenged him about what happened and challenged him first, Adam, what have you been up to? Adam shifted the blame. He passed the buck. He said, it was that woman you gave me. He's blaming her and him. It's an incredible statement. It's like the man saying, who left that chair in the middle of the room? It's always somebody else who's responsible for our mistakes. And so right from the beginning, when Adam should have led, Satan, I believe, knew what he was doing when he appealed to Eve as the head of the house. And he got her to make the decision, and her to take the lead, and her to take the fruit, and then give it to her husband, and he just took it. Satan had reversed the order of men and women, and he's still trying to do the same. He's doing it in quite incredible ways. Let me tell you just one way. A man came to me in Australia, greatly troubled. He said, David, I've been listening to you. He said, I agree with what you're basically saying. He said, I want to be the head of my house. He said, it's not that I want to be dictator, but I want to be leader. And I said, why aren't you? He said, my wife won't let me. And I said, what hold has she got on you? I said, I think I know. I said, have you given your manhood to another woman outside your marriage? And he said, yes. I said, then that's why she's got a hold of you. He said, what do you mean? Well, I said, you gave your manhood to someone else. That's put guilt on your conscience. He said, it was only the once. He said, you've probably heard the story many times over. He said, I was working late at the office, very attractive secretary. I met her at the coffee machine. We were the only 2 in the building. He said, you can guess the rest. He said, we got talking, and she was much more sympathetic than my wife is to my problems and the strains at work, and we got together and finished up on the floor together. He said, it was only once, never done it again. But he said, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I told my wife. I confessed it. And he said, she's never allowed me to forget it. Whenever I try to make a decision or take the lead, she points at me and she says, I wasn't the one to break this marriage up. I wasn't the one to be faithless. I was true to you. And he said, I just crumble. You see, a guilty conscience robs you of moral courage. You can't stand up for what is right when you've got something wrong like that in your conscience. And I had to persuade him very strongly that when God forgives, he forgets. So important that. God doesn't hold a thing against you. He forgets it. And one day when you face God and you say, God, now that I face you and I think of that, I'm so ashamed, I'm so sorry. God will say, you did what? I don't remember that. Isn't that amazing? I don't remember it. Your sins I will remember no more. That's forgiveness. One night I was preaching in church, and when everybody had gone home, there was a little old lady sitting in the front pew, weeping her heart out. I sat by her and put my arm around her and said, "What's the matter?" She said, 30 years ago, I did the most terrible thing. And she said, if my family knew about it, they'd never talk to me again. If my friends knew, that I'd have no friends. But she said, for 30 years, I've asked God to forgive me, and he never has. I said, you poor soul. He doesn't know what you're talking about. What do you mean? I said, the first time you asked for his forgiveness, he forgave you and he forgot about it. He can't remember it. She said, you can't mean that. I took her through text after text, which says that when God forgives, he forgets. I said, your problem is you can't forgive yourself because you can't forget. And you can't forgive yourself because you can't forget it. It's difficult enough to forgive someone else because you can't forget what they did. But God controls his memory and he can wipe it clean. That's real forgiveness. When the old lady realized the truth of it, she got up and she danced around the whole church. She was leaping for joy. Lady in her late 70s or early 80s, dancing. That's the kind of dancing I like to see in church. It's not the charismatic two-step. It's something much, much more real. And she was dancing for joy at the release. But this man wasn't, you see. And his wife kept throwing it in his face. As soon as she did, he went silent. He couldn't say anything. He was intimidated by his own guilt. Once I'd persuaded him that God didn't hold it against him and that he could go home and say to his wife, my God has forgotten what I did, and you must too. And he did. And it restored his authority in the home, restored the marriage to a proper Christian pattern. But you see, one of the things that unfaithfulness in marriage, or even fornication before marriage, can do is rob you of your moral authority within a marriage. Many men need to have that dealt with so that they can be free in their conscience to tell the family what is right and wrong, knowing that the family can't hold against them what they've done. Because all of us have done wrong and all of us have sinned, but it needs forgiving and being dealt with so that we're free to lead in home and church. Well, now, in the Bible, not only at the beginning, Adam was held responsible for what happened in the garden. From then on, leadership was male all the way through. Israel was led by a series of leaders in three categories. First by prophets, from Moses to Samuel. Then by kings, from Saul to Zedekiah. And then by priests, from, what's the name of the priest who came back from the exile? Not Zerubbabel, the other one. It'll come. Right through to Annas and Caiaphas. They were led by prophets, priests, kings, all male. When Jesus came to build the church, he didn't choose, as many are saying today, that he would, if he was starting the church today, choose 6 men and 6 women for apostles. He didn't. And that was not because he was, as people say, a child of his time, that he had to accommodate himself to the culture of the day. My Jesus never did that. He challenged his enemies about that. He said, do I fear God or men? Who do I try and please? And they were silent because he knew that he would go right against any tradition, any cultural custom that was not in line with the will of God. But he chose 12 men. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, the pattern is very clear. God is the head of Christ. Christ is the head of man, and man is the head of woman. Now today there's a huge debate, you'll find it mentioned in this book and dealt with, that head doesn't mean authority, that it means source, as when we talk about the head of a river. And that makes nonsense of the statement, God is the head of Christ. Because Christ was always there, he didn't need a source. But head there means the same as we mean by head of a business, head of a school, head of anything. And Jesus Christ is head of the church. Doesn't mean the source, it means he is the one who governs us, who leads us. who is responsible for us. On the basis of all that, the question arises, what ministry is open to women? And my answer is every ministry is open to women. Apostolic, evangelistic, pastoral, teaching, prophetic. Every ministry is open to women. It's not a question of what ministry is open to women, but the sphere in which it is exercised. And if it puts that woman in a position of authority over men, I believe it to be wrong. Women are encouraged to teach, for example, by Paul. And yet he said, I will not allow them to teach men, because that puts them in authority over them. Now that's my understanding of Scripture, that we men are to take the lead in mixed company, in family, and in home. We take the lead, not dictate. That is an abuse of leadership. Leadership is the kind that Christ has for the church. It is loving, sacrificial, considerate, sensitive leadership. But it is nevertheless leadership. We don't tell Christ what to do. Christ tells the church what to do. And similarly, a father has that responsibility within the home of leading the family, not of being a little dictator. My wife constantly reminds me to practice what I preach. It's quite uncomfortable because I'm always preaching, and she keeps remembering something I said years ago and says, you're not practicing what you preach. But one thing she constantly says to me, she says, I am more than happy to have you as my head when you have Christ as yours. And what she's saying is, I want you to be the kind of head he was. It is when men want to be the head of the house without acknowledging that they too have a head, Christ, that's when things go wrong and a man can become brutal, cruel, a bully within his own family, which is certainly not the will of God. So I believe women can be part of apostolic teams. They can bring prophetic messages. Miriam, the sister of Moses, did. Deborah did. They can be teachers, pastors. Every ministry is open to women, but not in a situation where she is taking authority over men. And to me, that applies to every group in the church, whether it's a small one like a house group or a huge one like the whole church itself. I predict now that within 30 years there will be a woman Archbishop of Canterbury. I won't be around to eat humble pie, but nevertheless, it is inevitable in the present trend. And the Vicar of Dibley is taking over. But you see, people are finding ways around it. Most of the new charismatic fellowships know in their heart of hearts that the fellowship should be under the eldership of men. So how have they got around it? They don't have elders. They have what is called a leadership team made up of husbands and wives. I'm sure you know of this. And in almost every case I know of that, they do not have any single women on that leadership team. Now, to me, that is worse discrimination. To say you can be a leader if you're married, but not if you're unmarried. Where is the biblical basis for that? Nowhere. But when I'm asked, can a woman be an elder? My reply is, certainly, if they are the husband of one wife. Because that's the qualification in Scripture. That's a facetious reply, but it's really hoping to bring a bit of humor into what can be a very tense discussion. Well, that is my conviction. I don't ask people to agree with me. I do ask them to think it through carefully for themselves and to check it out in Scripture. Because if we're Christians at all, then the Bible is our guidebook. And it is vital that people should not discuss it in the light of culture or contemporary expectancy. I was disappointed when the Archbishop of Canterbury, at the height of the debate about the ordination of women, said that he was voting for it because the church must be credible to contemporary society. And I open my newspaper this week and find out that the Methodist Church decides that you don't need to be a believer to be a member. That you are free to join the church, even if you don't believe in Jesus, because they believe that in 4 or 5 years' time as a member you will. This accommodation to society is a cul-de-sac. It's a dead end. The world despises a church that is constantly cutting its cloth to fit society in the hope of getting more in. The world respects, even if it dislikes, Christians who are different, who have the courage to say, I will live the life God's way, not everybody else's. It does take courage to run against the tide. Somebody wrote to me recently to encourage me after a particularly controversial book I'd written. And they just simply wrote one line, David, go with the wind, even if it's against the tide. I thought, I'm going to live by that. Go with the wind of the Spirit, even if it means going against the tide. Or as David said to Solomon, David on his deathbed, he said, Solomon, be a man and keep the statutes and commandments of God. Amen.